He's a 1976 Nobel Prize winner for excellence in economics. He has been a senior research fellow at the Hoover Institution in California since 1977. He is also Paul Snowden Russell Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Chicago, where he taught from 1946 to 1976. He is widely regarded as the leader of the Chicago School of Monetary Economics. He has published many books, including Capitalism and Freedom with Rose D. Friedman, Bright Promises, Dismal Performance, Free to Choose, and he has been a presenter of distinguished television series over PBS. We know him as a man who commands immense respect and immense attention while we listen to him. Professor Friedman.
I like brief introductions. Leave me more time to speak. In 1972, almost 20 years ago, President Nixon introduced the first intensified war on drugs since the original Harrison Act. I always get Harrison and Sullivan Act mixed. And in response to his introduction of the war on drugs, I wrote a column, at the time I was writing a column in Newsweek on a regular basis. And I wrote a Newsweek column on prohibition and drugs. In preparation for this talk today, I reread that column. Hardly a word in it would have to be changed to be publishable today and to be strictly contemporary. The only changes are really in inessential elements. In 1972, the problem for the United States was primarily heroin, and the chief source of the heroin was Marseille. Today, you would talk about cocaine and Latin America. But aside from that, nothing would have to be changed. Here it is, almost 20 years later. And the only changes is that what at that time were predictions are now observable results. I predicted in that column, on the basis primarily of the experience with prohibition, that drug prohibition would be ineffective in cutting down the number of addicts, and that it would promote a crime and corruption. How is it that the only effect on policy of the conversion of predictions into results has been to have the government dig itself deeper and deeper into a bigger and bigger hole and spend more and more of your and my money on doing harm? How is it? That's both the most discouraging aspect of this whole problem, and also the most intriguing intellectual puzzle. In our private lives, if we try something and it goes screwy, we don't just continue and do it bigger and bigger. Maybe we will for a little while, but sooner or later we can. Why is it that that isn't the case when we come to a matter like drugs and governmental policy? There's little point. I want to talk about that puzzle. There's little point in this group to my discussing in detail the case for the legalization of drugs. Everyone in this room knows it. You have had numerous workshops in which people who are more immediately familiar with the details than I have discussed the issues. And I'm not going to try to do that. I want to rather examine the puzzle that I listed. And in doing so, I'm going to rely on an adage that that traces back to 325 BC. Cobblers, stick to your left. My left is economics. the study of how society organizes its limited resources to meet the many and varied wants of its citizens, of its members. Fundamentally, there are only two methods by which society's resources can be organized. Only two, all mixtures of them, but only two. One is by market mechanisms. That's from the bottom up. The other is by command. That's from the top down. The market is one mechanism. Authoritarian organization, the military is a clear example, is the other. The general gives the order, the colonel passes it on to the lieutenant, captain, and so on down the line. In the market, the orders come the other way. The consumer walks into a store and gives the order, and the orders go up. They have very different characteristics and are suited to handle very different problems. I believe that some element of both is needed in any society, and whether I believe that or not, every society has some mixture of those elements. We know the extreme cases, and we know what happened in those extreme cases, particularly since the fall of the Berlin Wall. But what we have in our own society is also a very, very large mixture of those two methods. During the many years that I've been sort of peripherally engaged in discussing the issue of drugs, I should emphasize that's not a vocation of mine, it's an avocation. I've been very much impressed by two things. First, most of the literature I read on drugs takes it for granted that the drug problem is a special case to be discussed in terms of the particular issues associated with drugs, the substances involved and so on, rather than a particular manifestation of a more general phenomenon. And they take it for granted that it has to be discussed in terms of its own merits, involving an extensive knowledge of the details. It's as if, from my view, one were to discuss the desirability of theft in terms of what object was stolen. So theft of automobiles is one problem, theft of handbags is another problem. In the same way, people treat the prohibition of drugs as if it were a problem to itself. Second, one consequence of that view is that many of the people who propose doing something about the war on drugs propose alternatives which would be just as bad. They think that the problem is not that the government is involved in this, it doesn't have anything to do with that. Not that you're using the wrong mechanism, but simply they haven't done it right. That must, in my view, most of these would involve simply going from the frying pan to the fire. They not only think that the problem is that we aren't doing right, they have the illusion that if they could write the law would be enforced the way they wrote it. But that is an illusion. What happens to a law has very little relation, in general, to the intentions of the people who wrote it. The people who wrote the law on drugs did not intend to kill hundreds of thousands of people in the process. They did not intend to have a system under which you would have a multiplication of prisons and prisons. In general, the intentions of the people who write a law end up being the opposite of what the law actually achieves. A phenomenon that one of the congressmen here in an earlier guide, when he was a simple professor, termed the invisible foot of government. Let me illustrate with a few quotations from letters that I have received. One, quote, instead of merely decriminalizing drugs, let's have the government make available drugs free to every user.